little while. Both grizzly bears and black bears prefer to stay away from people, but when it comes to looking for food resources, sometimes we make that irresistible to them. And then whether it's feeding birds or pets in the backyard or open dumpsters, trash cans, fruit trees, beehives, all of unprotected farm animals, even campers when we're out and we have unprotected food sources, bears can be really tempted to enter into our space, into our communities, or our shared space with them. And conflicts with bears, unfortunately, usually means that the bears end up dying. And that has happened so frequently that we hope that all of us can kind of move forward and trying to understand what we can do ourselves and as our communities to help coexist with bears, making it safer for them and for us. We'd like to do a special thanks to the Foundation for Sustainability and Innovation for their support for this forum on how to coexist with bears. So with that, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about IWCN, and I'm going to share our website homepage with you so you can take a look at this while I'm talking. And we have a great website. We really have a lot of resources there that are available to everyone. We have a huge resource library on there on coexistence research, studies, abstracts, journals, books, videos, all kinds of things that can help you learn more about living with wildlife in your particular area. And we cover the globe. We're working with people on a daily basis that are in Africa, Nepal, Germany, Israel, throughout Australia. I mean, it's wonderful and exciting to be living in an age when we can actually connect with each other. And that's really the whole purpose behind IWCN, is that, years for now, we have been practitioners out there around the globe trying to find peaceful ways to coexist with wildlife in our own backyards, in our communities, in our states, in our provinces, in our countries. And often we did this on our own. We really didn't have resources. We didn't have colleagues to work with, because this is it's an emerging field in wildlife conservation, just learning how to teach people how to coexist with wildlife so that we can go away from these archaic practices of always resorting to either moving, pushing away, or even killing the wildlife that we're coming into conflict with. And as we know, we're living in a time when the earth is losing wildlife and wild places faster than any time in the last 3 million years, any time during which humans have walked on this planet. And if we maintain this path, these wild species that are so precious to us and so beautiful and so important to our world, they're disappearing, and they're disappearing at rates that is astonishing if you really look at how quickly this is happening in just our own lifetime. So coexistence is not only a great thought, a great idea, it's absolutely necessary in order for us to be able to salvage and then help restore the damage that we've done on the planet, so that we can have a different relationship, a different paradigm in how we manage our relationship and heal that with nature, so that we're working with her instead of against her. And it is so doable. In fact, it's better for everybody involved, not just the wildlife, but when we're living and using these practices, it's in a holistic manner that helps us have everything from better soil conditions, better food supplies, stronger communities, and a healthier ecosystem that supports us all. So it's really in our best interest to do this as well. And we are absolutely passionate about sharing this information and this work with the world and with all of the other organizations that we work with and are happy to support and promote. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Seth Wilson. He is the Executive Director of the Blackfoot Challenge. They are a leading collaborative organization in Montana, and they are coordinating efforts to conserve and enhance their natural resources and rural way of life in the Blackfoot Watershed. Seth has developed strategies to reduce conflicts with grizzly bears and wolves, and he's been an important advisor on coexistence issues in the US and Canada and throughout Europe. And that's really my great pleasure to welcome him to join us tonight for this webinar.
Well, Thank you, Suzanne, for such a gracious introduction, and thank you and your colleagues for all of the important work you're doing at IWCN. Thank you, Cindy and Allison and Lou. It's really our privilege to be here this evening, and looking forward to sharing some of the work we're doing in Montana. So thank you. I'll just jump right in here and get up to a full screen. Okay, so again, my name's Seth Wilson, and I'll try to share about 20 years of our work in roughly 10 minutes. So that's part of my challenge tonight, and I will just jump right in here. So when we're talking about grizzly bears in the lower 48 states, let's just bring everyone out here to Montana. And many of you are familiar with Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park that contain our two largest remaining populations of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states. There's some good news about these two populations of bears. We're starting to see expansion outside of what we call the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. You can see these areas in blue. These are designated areas from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is letting us know where we may have bears present, grizzly bears, and we're seeing this expansion outside of the Yellowstone ecosystem. And this is exciting for a variety of reasons. If we're interested in connecting populations of bears, and if we're interested in seeing populations expand as well. It does present an interesting challenge when we look at areas that are outside of our public land. So when bears start spending time in agricultural landscapes, which we have in Montana and in Wyoming and in places like Idaho, that brings in a new challenge for us to work with communities to live alongside bears. And so currently, just a real quick snapshot, bears are a protected species under the Endangered Species Act. Management is a combination of federal, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, collaborative work with the states of Montana, Wyoming, Washington, Idaho, and several Native American tribes, all coordinated under the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. So if I bring you to Montana again, I'd like to just bring you out here to the Blackfoot Watershed. Montana is a big state. It's actually bigger than Italy by about 80,000 square kilometers. It's a beautiful state. The Blackfoot Watershed is about 1.5 million acres, which is about the size of Delaware. So it's a large area and a very important part of this ecosystem, and it's largely intact. I'll talk in a bit more detail about some of our work in this very specific project area, where we started encountering bears recolonizing this agricultural landscape beginning in the late 1990s. And then really in earnest, our project started in the early 2000s. So as I mentioned earlier, this is an agricultural landscape. We've got 7 different small communities, cities, and small towns across about 4,800 households, about 10,000 residents. So low densities of people, and it's largely cow-calf ranching operations, forestry, and recreation. It's really an honor to get to work in this landscape with all of the species that we have here today. These same species that you see on the screen, from elk to wolverine, wolves, bull trout, lynx, our bears, all of these species were present when Lewis, on the Lewis and Clark journeys, was returning to the east in 1806. So 216 years later, we have all of these species present. We've worked hard with the Fish and Wildlife Service to restore trumpeter swan populations, and with wolf reintroduction in the mid-1990s, that expansion led to our first wolf packs in 2007. But tonight I'll talk about our 2 species of bears, grizzly bears, or what other folks in the world call brown bears, so Ursus arctos, and black bears. So we're lucky we have these 2 species in this landscape, yet they do on occasion cause conflicts and damages. And I'll just review a few of the types of conflicts that we work to find solutions to. So undesirable damage to human property. We have occasional livestock losses to grizzly bears. Very infrequently do we have brown bear predations on livestock, but it does happen. More frequently, we see silo damage, bears finding grain. Suzanne mentioned at the beginning of our talk, bears are coming out of hibernation. They're hungry, so they're looking for food. We have damages, property sometimes, and we have bears, of course, getting into garbage, both black bears and grizzly bears. Bears are resourceful. They'll find crops like corn here in this photo, crop of fruit trees, beehives, you name it. They can go out and find it. So we've been really fortunate to have an existing non-governmental organization that dates back to the early 70s called the Blackfoot Challenge. This group was formally incorporated as a NGO in 1993, and it's really provided a forum to bring people together for civil and rational communication, trust building through participatory work. I'll talk a little bit about some of the work I've done with the ranching community. And we've really worked hard over the years to bring people together in an inclusive way to balance values of communities of place and communities of interest. And what I mean by that is people who live and work there are communities of place. And then we have many interested communities from our cities in Montana to the north, throughout the Northwest, to folks all over the world in some cases who really are interested in Montana's wildlife and national publics of interest who care about endangered species recovery. So we really work hard to balance both of those important interests in our landscape. Some of those communities of place and interest mean, again, people who are living with our bears. We work closely with researchers, NGOs who also care about bears, and then we've worked very closely over the years with our state and wildlife managers from the state of Montana and at the federal level with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I like to think about collaboration as this inclusive table that everyone's invited to, and how do we do this successfully? I would suggest we need science as a major leg of this table. We need to coordinate resources. We need to incorporate different stakeholder values, and then we need some way to make decisions to get some of this work done. And all of this is varying depending on the ecological and social context that you're in. I would suggest in some of the places that you all may be working or living, these are some of the successful ways we've brought people together. I won't get into too much detail here, just wanted to say that over the last 20 years, we've really worked hard in the early years to sort of understand the problem, and we use some science and some geographic information system mapping, GIS. We worked very hard in sort of phase 2 to develop solutions. And then in phase 3, we're continuing to work on new innovations and continuing to bring science to our work to help us improve. But in those early years, we really needed to bring people together to understand the problem and think about this together. Some people define the problem as having too many bears coming out of the wilderness and onto private agricultural lands. And can't we build a fence separating bears from people from, say, the Bob Marshall Wilderness? So those are some of the problem definitions that were at the table in those early years. And in many cases, one simply has to listen and work through those with a community. And we came together to start thinking about it in a different way. We can't fence bears out, but how can we work on some of our own behaviors and some of our own practices? And that was evident by using some of the science and GIS mapping. It was a real pleasure for me to spend about 1.5 years working with the ranching community to map out locations where we would expect bears to show up. And for example, in this slide, we see in yellow here, these are called boneyards. And then in these little blue polygons, you can see those are called calving areas. And so this is the time of year in Montana and throughout the Rocky Mountain West where cow-calf ranching operations are having lots of newborn calves coming out at this time of year, and bears are out at this time of year. And so we've got also during this process, we have natural death loss. Occasionally calves will die, a mother calf may die, And typically, this natural death loss has been resulting in what we call boneyards or dead pits, where carcasses are simply left. And this can, as you imagine, will attract grizzly bears and wolves into very close proximity onto ranches and people and vulnerable calves. And so it really just escalates and increases the likelihood of having conflict. So this is one of the things we worked very closely in the early days to understand where all these were. We mapped out beehives and many other attractants. This allowed us to build some models to predict the likelihood of having conflicts with bears. And you can see here in red, these are areas where we expect more conflicts to occur. You can't really bear-proof an entire landscape when you're working in a place that's the size of Delaware. So you need to prioritize and direct that economic investment in prevention. And so we use science to help us direct where we needed to work. And this has resulted in dozens of projects, from beehive fences to calving area fences, residential fences, and so forth, in these high use areas where we have high use by bears and high risk of conflicts. And so this has been a driving force behind some of our work. I'll just show a few images of some of these fences that we use. This is a beehive fence. We use solar power to charge these up and deter bears. This is a calving area fence, protecting those vulnerable newborn calves. It's really only a 2 to 3 week window when they're really vulnerable to grizzly bears, but these are effective ways to non-lethally deter bears from having them eat cattle, livestock. These are this is a rural transfer site to protect garbage from bears. And I mentioned earlier in that previous few slides ago, this interesting situation with boneyards and calving areas. We've now started, we're in our 19th year of removing livestock carcasses off of about 120 ranches. And we pull off about 500 livestock carcasses every year, and we bring them to a site. And in partnership with the Montana Department of Transportation, we've been composting carcasses very effectively, along with the state that they're also composting roadkill deer and elk. And back in 2006-07, we asked the state of Montana if they'd be willing to try to compost livestock. So we hire a local driver. He goes out 3 times a week at this time of year, collects carcasses, brings them to this facility where they're monitored and composted, and the byproduct can be used for roadside revegetation or non-tabletop crops. And so it's been a great system, very well supported by the livestock community, and has really helped reduce the amount of time bears and wolves spend on ranches. A lot of nuts and bolts, what I call attractant management, and Heather's going to talk quite a bit more about bear resistant trash container use. And so we have to do this, even in these rural landscapes, we have to do this as well. This is an outfitter named Jack Rich, who's taken upon himself to build some systems to contain garbage. His livestock feed, horse feed's contained here, and he's made his whole barns simply bear-proof. So it's really wonderful when local residents take it upon themselves to develop their own solutions. We work very closely with our schools, reaching hundreds of students every year to work on bear safety, train young people how to use bear spray, and we do a lot of basic bear education and ecology as well. We've developed this neighbor network where we put our neighbors together. These are just locations of people's homes. And so in the early days, we used to use the good old-fashioned phone trees. When a bear was present, neighbors would call each other. It's evolved with social media, and this has been a great way, and a very low-cost way, to have people communicating with each other when bears or wolves are present, to take simple precautions. And it's also been a great way for the local community members to let our wildlife managers know about bear and wolf presence. So it's been a very low-cost way, and this has been replicated in many other parts of Montana with black bears as well. More recently, we're using some new science. We're working with the University of Montana to develop and build upon some of my early modeling, and now we're putting out some new maps to look at, again, those high-risk areas where we expect to have conflicts with bears, and that's helping us prioritize where our next generation of electrified fences will go in this landscape. An innovation we're working on is an electrified pad. And this may seem sort of simple, but it's important to ranchers who may need to get in and out of an area that's using an electric fence, and they don't want to have to spend a lot of time opening and closing a traditional swing gate. These electrified pads allow a rancher to drive over them or walk over them, and will deter bears. These are, as I mentioned, electrified. So this is sort of a new technology we're using to make the adoption and use of electrified fences even easier for folks. So what does this all get us? When we look back from 1998 to 2020, we see relatively low confirmed losses of livestock to grizzly bears. In fact, roughly less than 2 per year. When we look at this time frame, we've had more livestock losses over the last 3 to 4 years, likely due to a slowly expanding population and some changes in the range of bears as they're moving into new places. Yet we've got very low levels of actual losses to grizzly bears in this landscape. And if we look at both livestock losses and damages, for example, garbage types of conflicts, we see a downward trend over time. We've had a little spike in 2018, but in general, we're seeing low levels of conflicts as we work to live alongside grizzly bears here in Montana. So if I'll just to wrap up, we really have worked hard over the years to bring people together through a regular forum, and that's really been important for rational communication that's so lacking in today's where we don't believe in science, where people are prone to misusing the facts. It's been really heartening to have people here believe in science and respond to that. We've built a lot of trust through these participatory projects, as I mentioned earlier, from GIS mapping with ranchers to building these fences. That's critical for having that long-term community support. And as I mentioned earlier, when we bring together people who live and work in these landscapes with other people who are interested in this inclusive manner, it really results in these collaborative partnerships where I think we can coexist. And it's been a really wonderful place to spend 20 years of my professional life working. So I will leave it there. We've got a lot of people to thank, and again, it's really been a pleasure to be with you tonight, and I look forward to your questions. So thank you.
I know I have a lot of questions. Thank you, Dr. Wilson,
Sure.
and I'm so grateful. I mean, the work that you guys are doing is just absolutely inspiring. And I can't wait to hear. One of my questions, so you can be thinking about this already, is how does this model, how is it being duplicated in other places around the world? So when we get back to our question and answer session, I would love to have you talk about that a little bit more. So we're going to turn from Dr. Wilson to bring in Dr. Heather Johnson. She's a research wildlife biologist with USGS at the Alaska Science Center in Anchorage, Alaska. Heather has done extensive work on human tolerance regarding black bears, education, and the use of various non-lethal tools to keep bears from becoming habituated to human communities. Her work in Colorado was featured in the documentary Bears of the Durango, and if you haven't seen that or seen advertising for it, make sure that you take that link with you tonight, because it's just a fabulous film. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Johnson, and look forward to hearing her presentation as well. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Suzanne, and everyone that's organized this tonight. Let's see, I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Okay. Get this out of the way. Good deal. Okay. Well, thanks again so much for having me tonight. I thought this was really fun because Seth got to talk about what's happening with Blackfoot and really think about agricultural conflicts in particular, what's happening and all these different strategies on agricultural landscapes. And I'm going to talk instead kind of really zero in on residential development and my research on black bears, but a lot of it's still really relevant to thinking about grizzly bears too. So the work I did was as a researcher for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I'm currently up in Alaska at the USGS Alaska Science Center, but at the time I was a state wildlife researcher, and collaborated on this work with the city of Durango, Colorado State University, and the USDA National Wildlife Research Center. And, these are the kinds of conflicts that motivated our work. The same kind of things, it's fun to see all the different places you guys are from today on the chat, and, just how extensively so many of you guys overlap with black bear range. And so, this is a quick little picture of where black bears are in North America. And, they're just so widely distributed that so many of us are lucky enough to get to interact with them. And, as we well are aware, those interactions come with lots of challenges. And so the work that we did in Colorado was motivated by these growing numbers of conflicts that were happening. And the state wanted to understand first what was driving this increase in conflicts, and then how could we reduce conflicts, especially in these urban residential areas. So I'm just going to talk about that second part today in the interest of time. Okay, so before I really launch into it though, I want to just quickly talk about why it's important to reduce bear-human conflicts and why it's important to tackle this issue. And, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but something that I think is just important to always say with this is that the benefits of reducing conflicts, it's good for bears and it's good for people. And so I think, especially when, different groups kind of rally around their cities or their communities and how to reduce these conflicts, this is just such an easy win-win scenario that, if we can be successfully reduce conflicts, you're doing right by both the animals and the people. The other reason I think it's just really important to think about how we tackle these conflicts is that, wow, we expect more of them to happen in the future. So, part of that is just our landscapes are becoming more developed, and with the expansion of human food resources on the landscape, we should expect more conflicts in the future. And then the other big part of this is that we know that bears are changing their behavior. The figure that I have here, these two figures came from a paper that we published showing how bears select for town, in this case, the town of Durango, during good or poor natural food years. And when natural food years are good, where there's lots of food for bears to eat, bears don't really want to come to town. Those cool colors, they're avoiding town. They wanted to select for north-facing slopes with good berry communities, good moisture. But when we had scarce natural foods in the forest, bears all of a sudden recognize that town, human development, that this is a source of food subsidy. And, these are these years that these conflicts just go through the roof, and you have a lot of bear mortality. So we know bears are changing their behavior. They're learning to forage on human foods. And as they learn, we're going to see more conflicts. And the other thing is that with changing climate conditions, that in a lot of places, we're going to see more variability in natural bear foods, how the foods that bears should be eating in the wild. And we're going to see more frequent years where we have these failures, these natural food failures for bears. And that's going to drive the situation here where bears are going to seek out human development for subsidy. So lots of good reasons to tackle this problem. So we were interested in really looking at the effectiveness of residential bear proofing. We know that this is the solution that we hear about over and over again. If you want to fix the problem, lock up your trash, lock up your attractants. And that's easy for folks to say, but it's expensive to do. And so at the time I was working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we were saying this over and over, but for cities to bear proof, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so we wanted to really put it to the test and look at the data and see, how effective really is this? And is this what cities really do need to do and put money towards to reduce conflicts happening in the state? We know that bears primarily forage on garbage within developed areas, like within residential development. But yeah, we wanted to understand with all the challenges, does this really work? Does bear proofing really work? And so our two main research objectives were that first, we wanted to test the effectiveness of bear proofing to reduce human bear conflicts and increase public compliance with wildlife ordinances. In Durango, where I'm at, where I'll show you the state system in just a minute, but there was an ordinance that people needed to have their trash either locked in the garage or shed or in a bear proof container. It had to be secured except for when their trash is being picked up. You know, the morning of trash pickup, they could put their trash out on the street, but otherwise it had to be secure from wildlife. So that's what their ordinance said. We also wanted to assess public attitudes and behaviors related to bears, bear management, and bear-human interactions. So yeah, we looked at these questions in Durango, Colorado. So Colorado is this nice rectangular state. Denver up here, Durango's in the far southwest corner, and it's great bear habitat. You know, it's got this beautiful river running right through the Animas Valley. On all sides, it's surrounded by great public lands that is great bear habitat. And as you can see from my map here, Durango is a place where there's lots of interactions between bears and people. And all those little dots are conflicts that were reported or were observed by us. So to test the bear proofing idea, we did this giant experiment. We broke up the city of Durango. I think we've done it's probably the biggest bear proofing experiment that anyone's done. We broke up the city into 2 treatment areas and to two control areas. And we gave all the residents in the treatment areas a free bear resistant trash container. So this is myself and one of my colleagues prepping 1,000 bear cans to get deployed. We collected first pre-treatment data before we put the cans out. We collected data on conflicts. Then we started putting out the cans in 2013. And then we looked for the next few years on how well those containers worked in terms of reducing conflicts. And the key here, and I'll come back in a minute, whoops, is that the cans we put out had these clips on them, 2 clips you had to lock yourself. So, you know, I'm going to talk about compliance, you know, people's compliance with the ordinance. We gave people the can, but then they actually had to lock the can and unlock it. So the trash company can take the trash away and lock it when they were done. Okay, so to look at how well this really works, we looked at a variety of data types. We first looked at garbage conflicts in our treatment and control areas. Every morning we had someone driving around at 5 o'clock in the morning looking for places where bears had gotten into trash. We looked at what we called compliance behavior. You know, give you a bear can, do you actually lock the can and keep trash secure from bears? And the last thing was we did, we mailed out surveys to everyone in Durango and asked them questions about their behaviors and about their attitudes and different perspectives they had on the issue. So before we did we deployed the trash cans, this is what conflicts looked like across the study area. So, you know, we had this major hotspot of conflicts here. In our south treatment control, conflicts were really well distributed across the area. These were what became our different areas. So this became our treatment here and became our treatment. And then we had our paired controls. We put out the cans in 2013 and then looked to see how well that changed conflicts. What's interesting in this north part, what you see is that we reduce conflicts both in the treatment area, but also in the control area. In the south, those conflicts were really pushed from the treatment area down into the control. It's kind of a hot spot. Overall, in our post-treatment years, after we put out the containers, we saw that trash conflicts were 60% lower in the treatment areas than the control areas. And public compliance with the ordinance, like people keeping their trash locked up, that was 40% higher. But what we really saw is that giving people the cans wasn't quite enough. You know, we really had to understand this compliance when people actually lock their cans. And so, you know, we found these neighborhoods where people were at least 60% of, you know, your neighbors around you on the block around you, if everyone was locking up their trash, that really reduced your probability of having a conflict during a given week. But that was the key. In some neighborhoods, we gave out all these cans and in some cases, we only had 10% compliance of people actually locking the cans. So, one thing, you had to give people the infrastructure, and the other thing, they had to buy in enough to lock the containers. And if you could get at least 60%, then that made a real difference in terms of reducing conflicts. And it made a real difference makes a big difference for the wildlife officers. Within our study area, if we only had 10% compliance, we'd predict about 272 conflicts over the course of the summer, whereas if there was 80% compliance, we'd predict to have only about 45 conflicts. So, these make real differences in terms of management in the area and the officer responses. So, as I said, we also sent out these mail surveys to see how, doing this big experiment, how this influenced people's perspectives. And we found that people that got those bear cans, it really increased their satisfaction with management. People are really positive about it. They felt like the agency was really doing a great job. And we also saw that people that received those bear cans were also really supportive of ordinances and these kind of measures. And what was interesting is we saw greater support for ordinances across both groups. Even the folks that didn't get a bear can, they were also more supportive of ordinances and these measures as well. And it was an interesting thing because a lot of people they really wanted the bear cans. We get a lot of phone calls like, I see you put up bear cans a couple streets over, but we want one too. So it was a really popular management action that had a lot of support and had benefits, not only kind of the ecological side in terms of bears, but also the social side in terms of people. So what was interesting is we did the experiment. The city of Durango saw how effective it was, and then they decided, well, the city decided they wanted to keep putting out bear cans and put them out in those control areas that had no containers. So the city spent about $700,000 in deploying additional bear containers. And what was really cool is they deployed self-locking cans. So before we needed the manual locking containers, but they put out these self-locking cans that are always locked, except if you use your opposable thumbs to open the lid. And this was awesome because it was kind of this natural experiment. They put them right into our control area. So we got to see, well, how well does that work? If now pretty much everyone's got a bear resistant trash container, but we have two kinds. If you take out that compliance piece, how well does it improve things? So last summer we assessed the utility of these self-locking cans, and we had a grad student working on this from Colorado State University, Cassandre Van Lefebvre, and her primary advisor at the university, Stuart Brack. And, she found in terms of compliance, and we talked about compliance as being the key, people have to use the cans appropriately. And if people had those self-locking cans, compliance was 92%, whereas those manual clip cans, only about 40%. So, you could even want to do the infrastructure, even pay for the infrastructure, but the right infrastructure makes a big difference. And so this was some nice figures that Cassandre put together. This top plot here showing how we've changed the trash containers in the city of Durango from when we started. Most of the containers were all just regular trash containers. We started putting out our cans for the experiment in 2013. And a lot of people, even though they didn't get a free bear can, they saw other folks get one, they started ordering from the city. And then after we finished the experiment, then the city bear proofed the remaining. And so you can see this massive switch that's happened. And in the lower plot, I'm showing you the number of weekly conflicts that has also happened over time across those same years. And you can see, that, in these last couple of years, getting pretty effective at really dropping those conflicts, that this has made a huge difference. And last year was interesting in that there are more attempts, like bears that knocked over a can, but they never were successful at getting the trash. So more attempts last year than ever recorded. So, cans are being used and they're being successful, and they're not allowing the bears to get into them. So, in summary, we found that using these containers in residential areas, it reduced bear human conflicts. It increased public compliance with wildlife ordinances. It improved public perceptions about bear management. And it was most effective when the containers were self-locking. So, again, kind of win-win. This is all win-win for both bears and people on all fronts. And so, yeah, as Suzanne mentioned, there's a documentary about the work we've done, not just with the cans, but more broadly about bears and both the kind of behavioral and demographic factors that are responsible also for kind of driving these increases we're seeing in conflicts. That's available on PBS. So if you search it on PBS, you should be able to watch it. And it's been effective for folks to use this documentary in part to start some grassroots energy about how do you change how do you change bear proofing and think about conflicts in your community? I say I've published a lot of papers on this topic, but it's not nearly as effective for most people as to watch Dusty's documentary. And so folks have been using the documentary to kind of spearhead conversations with city officials, city council members, and other groups to think about, what kind of ordinances should be in place and what kind of infrastructure changes need to happen to reduce conflicts. So with that, though, I will also put up briefly our list of publications that we've done on this topic, just as a reference for folks. And and thanks so much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's just really exciting to see the work that you're doing. And I saw all the questions were starting to just mount up. So there's, beyond me, there's a lot of other people that have questions. So with that, I think, why don't we go ahead and start answering those? And Louise, did you have any that came to the top?
So the first question is for Seth, and there was quite a few questions around when you did the GIS mapping to understand where were those conflict hotspots. So a question from Pamela Williams is, why were those two particular areas identified as high for conflict? Was there a greater density of boneyards, or why were they identified as those hotspots for conflict?
So with that specific model run, we found that it was a combination of habitat, so that those riparian areas really are bear movement corridors. So we get a lot of bears using natural habitat. And in some of our more recent analysis, we're finding that the presence of a residence, so someone's house there, is a strong attractant. So that's also can be a surrogate for having a calving area in close proximity, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Seth. Just leading on from that, Lizzie
Sure.
Pennocock asked, she's wondering if these maps are publicly available, or if you could possibly email them, or how can we?
We're working on publishing some of this recent work, and once that's published, absolutely happy to share some of those mapping outputs. Yeah, we can do that.
Great. We'll make sure that once you publish that work, it's on our IWCN Coexistence library.
Perfect. Thank you.
Over to Cindy for the next question.
Seth, how many times per week are the carcasses collected? This is also a question from Pamela.
Sure. Yeah, 3 times per week right now. And then, so that's during the heaviest period of calving. So that begins in mid-February and it runs till about the middle of May. So we have a local driver who's out there 3 days per week. And then we actually hire on a more seasonal basis another individual to pick up the occasional carcass the remainder of the year. So we actually are removing carcasses 365 days a year, and it costs about $20,000 to do that.
The next question is really about a question I also had when I was in the US and hiking. What should we do if we come across a bear when we're hiking in the woods? Is bear spray enough, or are there some other things we can do to de-escalate conflict? And I guess this is for both Heather and Seth.
You want to jump in on that, Heather?
That's okay. Go ahead and start.
Yeah, I would say, anytime you suspect you're in bear country, it's a good idea to have bear spray and to know how to use it. That's the short, quick answer.
Yeah, and generally, just making some noise, a little, making sure the bear knows you're there, and just backing away slowly. That's gonna be fine. In most cases, I clap my hands and say, "Hey, bear," and then they're gonna run the other way. That's how pretty much every one of my bear encounters has almost always happened.
But do you need to make
I
yourself?
would echo that's the same. Sorry, go ahead, Lou.
No, I was asking, do you need to make yourself appear bigger to a bear or just make noise?
No, you need to just be aware and be smart about it, and not create any you don't want to frighten the bear. So being calm, talking softly, making some noise, backing away slowly. Typically, that's good protocol. And I've just echoing Heather, the encounters I've had with grizzlies and black bears have, in almost all cases, the bears have maybe taken a quick look at you and have left the area. So.
And don't run, right?
Correct. Right.
Here's a question from Stephen Pope. So if natural sources of food are scarce and the bear seeks out sources of food near humans but is deterred, where do the bears find food and nutrition?
Yeah, so bears, you mind if I start with that one, Seth?
Go ahead,
Okay.
please.
Yeah. I mean, bears are really good at just dealing with these years of food scarcity. They've evolved to do it. So what happens with the bear usually is they do find themselves, bear survival really, even during those years of food scarcity, survival really doesn't change. It's bear survival is pretty much constant. But what you see is they don't have enough resources to reproduce. So you won't see bears, they'll skip a year for reproduction. They won't have cubs for the year, but they'll just kind of keep whatever resources they can for themselves to survive and reproduce, another year. So the bears themselves are very well adapted to dealing with, a food shortage in a given year. You just see it in kind of a downturn in reproduction, and then that will come back. I mean, these guys are long-lived, really long-lived. So, they can come back another year and reproduce when those food resources are available.
We have a lot to learn from bears. As our own species.
I would just add that, when we have those really poor food years, then we have to be extra vigilant as people to contain our attractants and to help reduce mortality, because we see that trend when bears are really food stressed, they're really seeking out actively some of our food sources, and so that's when we can see concurrent spikes in bear mortality through management removals. And so that's the other sort of, that could be particularly problematic if too many females are dying during those poor food years. Sometimes females with cubs will be pushed into either less secure habitat by large males as well. And so you'll sometimes see females more visible with cubs, and you really hope that you don't have to have those members of the population removed. So there's quite a bit going on during those poor food years.
Yeah, and I should just clarify, I was speaking in the kind of natural conditions, but then the bears, but that's exactly right. The bad food years, and bears in the wild are fine, but it's the bears that come into human development that then their mortality risk goes way high during those bad years. I mean, crazy like in Durango, we documented a 50% decline in the female bear population associated with a major natural food shortage from bears coming in to seek out human food sources and getting hit by cars, dying, removals, lethal removals, accidents, all kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's.
Another question is, folks in Washington state are trying to recover grizzly bears in the North Cascades. Do you provide programs or best practices that other communities can draw on to be confident about existing workable solutions to address concerns?
Short answer, yes. And if folks in Washington state are interested, we always love to have people visit Montana, see our work firsthand. So open door, and if there's any resources, information, we can, if you'd like any of we've got lots of materials we can share. And, with the Zoom capabilities, we could certainly set up any sort of, seminar to visit, webinars. So Absolutely. Just reach out to us. We really appreciate it when people reach out to us versus sort of us sort of coming into a place and imposing our work. We really like it to be, generated from the source. So happy to help.
Yeah, maybe the only other thing I'd add to that is that, it's all about attractant management, whether you're in agricultural areas or ex-urban or, more residential urban. I mean, this is, and the kind of the bottom line is wherever you're at, to coexist with these guys, you just got to figure out how to manage those attractants so that's not accessible to bears.
Just to add a little there too, we have to think about scale. The scale of home ranges for bears is large. So these bears are moving across landscapes in and out of our communities. And so in the North Cascades, it really is beneficial if, neighbors and residents and, ranchers, you got to work together. And I didn't really get to talk too much about that in our work, but it's not going to work if only a handful of people are being, bear smart. It really takes a larger collective once. And so that process requires people coming together to talk about how to do that at a larger scale. And so it's really that process of building trust, understanding it, using the amazing science that Heather can do. All of these sort of pieces can kind of come together, but you have to work at the right scale in these communities. And that goes for wolves as well, but that's another story.
Heather, do the Durango ordinances include restaurants and other commercial areas?
Most of that was targeted at residential, but the city now has been working on getting all the commercial bear approved as well. So it's kind of happened in phases. The biggest issues in Durango are mostly residential. It's just so much more of the community, and along that urban wildland interface, that's all residential development. So it was the bigger thing to tackle, the bigger issue to tackle. But now that's kind of under control, they're going after the commercial side too.
Fantastic.
This is a question for both Seth and Heather. Is there less of a push to hunt bears in the areas where conflicts have been reduced?
That's an interesting question. I would say, there's certainly, I don't know. That's a good question. I'd have to think a little more about that. I would say that given sort of the political climate in places like Idaho or Montana, there's certainly a lot of interest throughout the state to hunt grizzly bears again.
Mm.
Yeah.
So the conflicts might not be a driver of that desire to hunt. It's some other aspect, like social or some other aspect.
I think, and it crosses sort of socio-demographic, it crosses lots of different groups of folks who are interested in hunting bears. We have, very few people that I work with have expressed interest to me in hunting bears in the Blackfoot, but they may not be openly talking about it either. It's hard to know.
I wonder if the question is more directed toward mortality, though. If it's like, are these conflict reduction efforts reducing bear mortality? And I think that might be another way of coming back to that. Yeah.
No, we've seen definitely. We've been fortunate to be able to reduce annual mortality for bears in our area, given our work. Yes.
In terms of like the residential conflicts, often that's touted as a management solution is, increased harvest. It's an easy knob for wildlife agencies to turn to reduce conflicts. We're just going to increase harvest, but generally that has not been found to be an effective solution. The places that conflicts are happening and the places where people are harvesting bears are not the same, often not the same places. And so there's been, of the studies published on that, it just has not proven to be a very effective solution for reducing conflicts.
Can you guys talk about how the models that you've developed, if people are either interested in doing it in their own communities, or are there examples out there of where this is being duplicated in other places, potentially even around the world?
Sure. Do you want me to start, Heather, with A couple thoughts. Well, I guess the first question is sort of what do you want to transfer? So I would say the process is really important, and so that means sort of that means bringing people together in some sort of civil forum and respectful way to sort of think about collaborating and particularly in, say, these types of rural landscapes where I'm most familiar. I think our process of bringing people together has been a more powerful way to then adopt all the tools. We have so many tools out there, and it's just really a question of making them useful, cost effective, and having them be adopted. And so we've worked. So so the process is really important by bringing people together. We've done a lot of field tours with ranchers from Southwest Alberta, from ranchers all over Montana, from Washington State. For many, many years, we've had this sort of field tour component of our work that allows peer-to-peer communication. So rancher to rancher, wildlife manager to wildlife manager. We've done a lot of that over the years, and that's been, I think, a helpful way to see some of our programs get adopted and used in other landscapes. For example, livestock carcass removal has been spread into several other parts of Montana, Southwest Alberta. Electrified fencing work is being expanded in the region. The other part of the cost piece of all this is making this affordable. We're working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to get what they call a standard practice. This is a fancy way of saying, hey, this agency can help pay for a 5-wire electric fence through one of their programs. And it's just taken a long time to build that. And so this is going to allow a public agency that's got a lot of horsepower, a lot of dollars behind it, potentially make a 5-wire electric fence affordable at a 75% cost rate for other people in Montana and hopefully throughout the region in the West. So you start small to sort of proof of concept some of these things out, and then ideally we can get them transferred and developed for lots of other people in other places. That's just that was a response, I guess. Heather, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in terms of like the residential stuff, it's like grassroots efforts that are most effective in instituting change. So I think this is where this kind of forum is really cool, that it means like municipalities have to make ordinances or have to require infrastructure, and agencies, we can't do that. You can't do that. It takes communities to make those decisions. So it takes people working with their city councils and really starting kind of grassroots community efforts to push these changes to happen. So I think that's what's really cool about this movement, especially coexistence. It's often community driven, and we want to provide information to help with that and support that. And if you want to speak at a city council meeting, or you want where Missoula is showing the video with their city council and officials to try to institute change there, and on May 11th. And so I think a lot of this can be driven really by the community.
It seemed like it would really help the community spirit as well, of bringing people together to solve something that's a local problem and helping each other to do that. And I love seeing that kind of synergy when those communities come together. Do we have any more questions? How are we doing?
Yeah, we actually have a number of more questions, but we're over our time. So I want to give one question that I think would be useful for everybody to hear from both of you. Aside from garbage and boneyard carcass piles from ranches, what other common human caused attractants are there that have potential for human bear conflict situations?
We have a lot of problems with, for example, bird feeders. That's a huge issue in many places in the US, for example. That's just one example of an additional attractant. Heather, any thoughts?
Yeah, bird feeders are a big one. This is the time of year to take them down.
Yeah.
And fruit trees, non-native fruit trees, man. I mean, what a great food source for bears. you know, it just really draws them in when you have a massive apple tree and there's fruit all over the ground. That's, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, that's a big one that draws a lot of bears into areas. And again, there's tools to deal with it, between electrifying areas around trees, by doing fruit removals, gleaning programs to get that, you know, that fruit out of there. So yeah, there's lots of strategies, but really any attractant, right? Pet food, livestock. Yeah, I mean, all kinds of any attractant on your property that a bear can eat. They have the same stomachs like ours. They can take advantage of almost anything.
We have people who feed deer. So the feeding deer, you know, if you're feeding deer corn, that can attract bears. And if you're leaving your grill out, they'll find that. If you're not composting effectively and it's getting really smelly, that, you know, your compost, there's a long list. Yeah.
Backyard chickens might be another one too. That
Chickens have been a huge issue. Yeah. Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
And there's lots of things you can do for all of those to help avoid causing bears to come in as an attractant. So we'll be sure and provide those resources for everyone that's participating. And then when we post this on the website, we'll get all of those studies together, Heather, that you shared, and put those up as well, so that that's a resource for everyone. I can't believe it's just wonderful to hang out with you guys. I would love to stay for the whole night because it's just so inspiring to hear the work that you've done, and hopefully this is going to spread and continue to spread to other communities, and whatever we can do to help support that, we're thrilled to. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and also to let you know that we have other forums that are coming up as well. We've covered a whole bunch of things around the globe so far. We've gone to snow leopards in Nepal. We've done koalas. We've done wolves in the Northern Rockies. We've been everywhere. And if you have ideas of projects that you'd like us to cover, please let us know. And we're just really excited to be able to participate with all of you. And thank you for joining us tonight. And I think that's it. Cindy, did I miss anything? Are we doing? Are we good?
We'll try and follow up. There were a few questions that we weren't able to get to, so we'll try and get Heather and Seth to respond to those, and we'll share that information as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, good night, everyone. Thank you again,
Right.
and we look forward
Thank
to
you.
seeing you next time.
Thanks.